whenever we're talking about jouissance, we're talking about something that's it's not just, pleasure principle, sailing along, cool breeze, whipping through your hair. It's excessive, and it's disruptive, and it's painful. It's exciting. It could be depression, though. Like if you're flooded with, in certain forms of depression, you're flooded with jouissance, basically a kind of painful, like despair. So just to say that there's a kind of cruelty in this path of commanded jouissance, but it's specifically in relation to your lack, and it's a this excessive sort of painful way of sticking to the path of jouissance versus the path of desire, of subjective desire, which in fact has more freedom.
Greetings, friends and comrades. Daniel is back again with an episode on Lacanian thought and social critique with the one and only Stephanie Swales, who is at Dublin City College. She is a professor,
Dublin City
writer.
University. Sorry.
Dublin City University. I will not edit that, but these slips are important, you see. What's the difference between a slip and an error? She's also a psychoanalyst. Perhaps that question can be answered today. But we are here to talk about an essay that Stephanie wrote for a collection of essays in a book called Lacan's Cruelty, edited and put together by Mira Lee. The title of this essay is Neoliberalism and Liminality, Perverse Cruelties in the Age of the Capitalist Discourse. And Stephanie has also written, by the way, an excellent book on the concept of perversion in society and culture, as well as in the clinic, on a book also on empathy, which I'm less familiar with, but maybe you can share something about that at a later time with us.
Especially since the book hasn't been published yet. I'd be happy to
that would
share
make
something
sense
at a later time. Yeah.
That would make sense. Yes. I was unclear if it was out yet. When does it come out?
It'll be sometime next year, but the book with Carol Owens on ambivalence is the only other published book at the moment.
Well, that's quite a lot, Stephanie. So congratulations on being prolific there. And yeah, so you're a Lacanian psychoanalyst. Is that
Yes.
right? What got you into Lacanian psychoanalysis?
Well, I was interested in psychoanalysis even into my early teenage years. My first entry into it was dreams. Dreams were cool. And it's just fascinating, reading Freud's interpretation of dreams, thinking about the other scene of the unconscious, and dreams as the royal road, of course, interpreting my own dreams. And so I had been, reading as much as I could in the area of psychoanalysis for some years before it just sort of happened upon Lacan. It doesn't really happen so easily. When I was a psychology major, figured I had to become a clinical psychologist, or at least I'd rather become a clinical psychologist than a would have rather than a psychiatrist to be able to practice psychoanalysis. But Lacan isn't really mentioned in typical psychology programs, so it was just kind of by chance that I learned about him. And I was just kind of swept away by the different ways in which the psychoanalytic subject was considered via linguistics and philosophy. It just seemed to be so much more of a compelling argument about the way that human beings are structured. And I have always loved the clear connection between subject and other, which makes him so, as you would know well, so good for thinking about politics and theory and all kinds of other fields, rather than just, looking at the psychoanalytic clinic as expansive as that can be.
Thank you for that. So cruelty is sort of ubiquitous in our culture, and to some extent it is normalized. And I want our goal, sort of in the time we have for this discussion, is to sort of help listeners get a better understanding of what Lacanian thought, Lacan's unique angle on the problem of cruelty, where he might help us clarify our thinking about this as a social phenomenon in particular. And perhaps one of the ways to begin that conversation, there's many ways to begin that, would be to begin with an analysis or a sort of introduction to the concept of the four discourses. I love the period of Lacan's teaching where he turns to discourse theory. This happens in the wake of May 1968. So there is an immediate sort of political relationality to this. A lot of commentators have said that Lacan's theory of the discourses are also a way for him to make a contribution to and a continuation on Freud's writings on groups and group psychology. So he is literally taking his teaching into a social dimension. And one of the ways we get at this question is through something which maybe you could call esoteric or elusive, but Lacan intends for it to be so, is that he says there's four discourses, but that there's also a fifth discourse, what he calls the discourse of the capitalist. And this discourse could spell the ruin of discourse as such. So I've given you perhaps a tall order here, Stephanie, which is to, or I'm about to give you a tall order, which is to help us introduce the concept of the four discourses as a way into understanding this problem of cruelty, perversion, etc. Because you make the claim in your essay that the capitalist discourse has a structural propensity for accelerating cruelty, right? This is actually one of its primary effects. So before we understand why that's the case, can you tell us what Lacan's four discourses perhaps is all about? And I can also jump in because I've studied it a bit, although it's, of course, it's very difficult in some sense.
It's often the case when I meet people who have just started studying Lacan that are outside of the practice of clinical psychoanalysis, that they'll start with Seminar 17, in which he presents the first versions of his four discourses. And I think that's no accident. It's just can be so relevant to bridging to ways of thinking about how the subject is makes a link to another in these different ways within culture that each have different effects. I would, however, say that I wouldn't recommend starting with seminar 17. I'd recommend starting with seminar 1, even if you're not planning on being a practicing psychoanalyst. But that's perhaps neither here nor there. But it is something that I find myself returning to again and again. One of the seminars that I think I've read the most often. And so, he's coming within a time when, certainly there's other notions of discourse that are, within French philosophy, especially, Foucault has his own, definition of discourse. But for Lacan, it is a way of relating to the other that operates even in the absence of speech. So, we think of discourse, just our immediate association would be speaking. But these sorts of things, are more about how we situate ourselves in relation to the social world. And each discourse has a distinctive way of dealing with what Lacan calls the non-rapport of the sexual relation or the relationship, and essentially the ready source of discontents, the Das Unbehagen that we're dealing with as human beings. And so each, we could say that each discourse, except for each of the 4 discourses, except for the discourse of the analyst. So we've got the discourse of the master, the discourse of the hysteric, the discourse of the university, and the discourse of the analyst, or the original 4 discourses before we bring in the discourse of the capitalist. That each one of these, except for the discourse of the analyst, essentially has its own way of denying the non-rapport. So its own way of fantasizing that the other is complete, is a complete other, and that the self also can be complete. So that there's some way of sort of truly connecting with the other in whatever form that might take. It might be an institution, even, not necessarily another person. Excuse me. But also thinking of the other of language. So it's a way of trying to deal with the fact that language fails us all the time. It never perfectly communicates our experience, even just at the level of thought. There's always a gap between our experience and what can be expressed, between our words, maybe what we intend, and then what the other person hears. Just the slipperiness of language that then kind of has mass effects on human relationships. That human relationships have to be, in order to form a relationship, there's no fixed recipe to do it. We have to use discourse. We don't necessarily in any one interaction have to use words, but we have to rely upon the system of language to do so. But it's an imperfect way of doing so. So I'll give just like an example of if you're going to a dance club or something like that, there's a certain kind of system of rules, and you might want to find a dance partner or several, a group of people to dance with. Not necessarily saying anything. Maybe even if you did, it couldn't be heard because it's so loud. That there's a way in which you're relating to the other. You're forming some kind of social bond at that time. So it's each of the 4 discourses is a way to form a link in the social world, and to deal with the fact that there's no given, stable, surefire way to connect to the other. So that's, kind of idea of how they function, what they are. There's, could spend way too long talking about that. Is there something in particular you want me to shift to within
that's great.
discourse theory?
No, that's very helpful. I suppose in a way it's it's an extremely elucidating sort of display that Lacan puts out, it's kind of like an exercise in visualizing a structural relation to incompleteness, as you say, but also how subjectivity deals with its fundamental division. And that division is born from, on the one hand, a wider claim that Lacan is making about our insertion into the field of language, but also about a division having to do with our relationship to the pleasure principle and to enjoyment or jouissance. And I love, for example, right now we're studying the subversion of the subject and the dialectic of desire from Lacan's decree. And you really can look at the graph of desire and see that the upper part, he's talking about a subjectivity of enjoyment, and the lower part is talking about the subject really of the signifier of language, which he calls the scientific subject. And so in a certain way, I feel that the problem with the capitalist discourse revolves around enjoyment, right? And this historical claim also that, and this is something that, I think a lot of Lacanians, or that has made Lacan famous, it's a sort of motto, right? That the superego of our time is one that commands us to enjoy, and that moreover, the superego of our time, the authority structure of our time, is experiencing some type of panic about the absence of the traditional patriarchal father arrangement, not only in the family, but across institutions, right? So already with Lacan's theory of the capitalist discourse is kind of like a historicized claim, right? That makes it very applicable. I don't want to use the term to postmodern, but let's just say to the modern condition. And so let's talk now about this question, because one of the ways that your essay is linking Lacan's theory of the capitalist discourse is you're also linking it to this notion of liquid modernity and to the idea of liminality. So I think the next question would be to introduce liminality. We'll, of course, come back to this theory of the capitalist discourse. But there's something about subjectivity in our time, which is liminal, right? And I always, like we were just watching this incredible Hollywood film called Arrival, about aliens coming to Earth. And it's a very Lacanian film if you actually think about it, because it's all about solving the riddle of the other, in this case, literally the alien, through language and communication, as what's sort of most vital in humanity. But what was very interesting is that my wife said that it reminded her of her youth and the liminal experiences of freedom of her youth. Because you see, liminality also, at first blush, or maybe prima facie, kind of feels like free, like in a way, or it's like it's a certain type of subjective freedom, perhaps, in which you are in between spaces of regulated order, or you're sort of not submitted
Mm-hmm.
to regulation or to like a regime of control. You're sort of subtracted from it, maybe. And so, but liminality, it turns out, is actually a paradoxically monstrous condition, in fact. Or is it? So maybe now, maybe introduce this concept of liminality, help us understand what that means, and then we'll go back to the Lacan piece.
Sure, yeah, and it's been way too long since I've seen Arrival, so I can't really engage with you on that. Good film. That's about you know
Yeah,
about as
because
much as I can.
her point is that her point is almost like, when you understand the linguistic system of the other, you are capable of a full you transcend the what Lacan would call the kind of imaginary totalization that language has over your body, and then
Uh-huh.
you enter into a new temporality. Because remember, the whole conclusion of the
Yeah.
film is that the language is the weapon. The language is the weapon that aliens will
Right.
give for yeah, like some kind of phenomenal perception of the future. So,
Mm-hmm.
anyways.
Yeah, and I'm remembering that there was a kind of assumption of aggressivity and a lot of fear, of course, so they're relating on the imaginary, and then here she comes in as a translator, bringing things to the symbolic, but things are a bit too neat and tidy for Lacanians, whereby language is the key that kind of solves everything. Yeah. Well, so um, with liminality, this is something that Carol Owens and I, who's a frequent collaborator, had started thinking about way too long ago, and our thought is, related to a kind of question about what types of how is the subject today, or how is the speaking being rather today affected by the capitalist discourse and just the contemporary faces of all five discourses, really, but in particular the capitalist discourse. There's, in our clinical work, we're both practicing psychoanalysts. In our clinical work, I'd say we both see the quote unquote old symptoms, the good old fashioned, guilt-induced or propagated repression for the obsessional who's inhibited and can never act, on their desire, let alone their jouissance. So, I mean, absolutely still there. So, I wouldn't say it just literally doesn't make sense to say that the capitalist discourse has replaced these other four discourses, but that it exists alongside these other four discourses. There's some argument about, is it a real other discourse, because there's only so many permutations with the rotations of the four signs, the master signifier, the S2, the split subject, and the object A, as Lacan originally theorized it. But in any case, the capitalist discourse is thought to be this kind of contemporary subversion of the master's discourse. And so our, kind of clinical but also theoretical question is, what sorts of symptoms, what sort of ways of grappling with these sufferings are we seeing in contemporary times alongside these more traditional ways of suffering, if that makes sense. And liminality was one way in which we had and have to conceptualize this. And I think So I'll just kind of speak to some of the nuts and bolts of it, but there's a lot of interesting ways we can take it, beyond what I mentioned in the chapter there. So there's, it tends to correspond nowadays to postmodern theory. I know you hesitated to say the word postmodern earlier, but in liminality studies, if there is such a thing, about that are connected to the capitalist discourse, or rather neoliberalism, neoliberal ideology. I'd say Lacan's conceptualization of the capitalist discourse back in 1972 is really in like the super early days of what we might consider to be the burgeoning of the neoliberal version of it and movement of it. So it's kind of helpful to think about in full force, what does the capitalist discourse look like with this kind of more contemporary neoliberal way of operating versus what might have been more the case in the 1970s, or just with the system of capitalism, of late capitalism. We can get back to that, but so with liminality, it's tied to this what we see as a kind of superegoic dictate to reinvent yourself, to innovate. That's corresponds to the sort of homo economicus of the contemporary subject, as Foucault put it, such that in order to make it in the contemporary world, to be seen as an attractive employee or have a good business model, or even at the level of being cool or desirable or something on a social level, there's this kind of I don't know, this kind of ideal of ceaseless reinvention or creativity, and that if you're not doing this sort of betwixt and between identities, versions of you, then, well, if that's gosh darn it, that's the reason why you're failing. That's the reason for your suffering. And it does correspond to studies about companies saying that one of their top priorities is innovate and be creative, and always, of course, within the larger rubric of making money and capitalizing on human labor, extracting things, etc., from the consumer, the person defined as consumer. But so it's really that in the kind of shift away from more singular modes of how to be and how to live one's life, including one's jouissance. How are you supposed to enjoy, or how are you supposed to control your enjoyment and put it in check? Yes, religion is still with us in various forms, but for instance, in Belgium, just over the period of the past 30, 40 years, what a huge transformation to largely agnostic culture from what had been a religious one. So we are seeing like really sweeping changes that correspond, at least time-wise, to this period of late capitalism. So in other words, in the absence of what we might associate with the master's discourse kind of ways of situating your identity, I am this, you would say in the master's discourse. So you're under the bar, is your split, is your lack, is your uncertainty about, am I this? You're just like, yeah, I am a Catholic. And that has its whole, so anytime you state anything with authority, and typically some of the things that we tend to do, of course, still today, state with authority, have to do with our identity claims. I'm from this place. I am, Pisces. I'm not, by the way, excuse me, whatever comes to mind. But these kinds of things carry some sort of authority and weight. Whenever you're stating something with confidence, you're in the master's discourse.
Right.
And so in the capitalist discourse, there's a kind of a loss of these stable associations within S1, with a master signifiers that we can use to ignore or explain away our suffering to try to produce something else. And, I do see us in an age of liminality in some ways in which certainly there's suffering. There is suffering associated with the position of liminality, right? Because it feels good to nominate yourself with something. I think I mentioned in the chapter, like little internet quizzes that I used to see a lot more of when I was a teenager for obvious reasons. You're just like, oh yeah, my Harry Potter sorting hat says I'm this. Like, even if it's stupid, it just feels nice. And so all the more important are these, stable signifiers of our identity in the social world. So when we lose that, or when, they themselves seem questionable or seem lacking, or when they're attached with this superegoic dictate to reinvent yourself and change, there's a lot of turmoil of the drives that erupts, and it's hard to find a different way to navigate. And now I'll gesture towards another side, and then I'll let you speak, which is I am an analyst. I'm pretty silent in analysis, but I'm also a professor, so I can talk too. But so the other side, right, is things like the creative and inventive, as I was just saying, that can be used with the capitalist discourse in a way that gives the semblance of freedom, but is actually more restrictive for the subject. But it can also, Mari Rudi's work on creativity, of course, gives us some emancipatory possibilities. So I'm thinking of gender non-binary, for instance, and just how much more common that as an identity label. It is an identity label, right? It's not that it's the absence of one, but it's a way of indicating more of an just the sort of silliness or arbitrariness of notions of what counts as, gendered female versus gendered male, and that there's these two binary categories, et cetera, et cetera. And similarly, I suppose, but in a very different example, we could think of the identity of, which I'm learning more about recently, the practice of being a digital nomad. Are you familiar with this?
I think so. Is that somebody that is capable by virtue of their occupation to travel around the world or not be in a fixed place?
Yeah, exactly. So there's these digital nomad hotspots, and Carol and I write about liminal hotspots and things like that too. So you're not fixed to a certain domicile, and typically, not even within a particular country. And it is advantageous in the system of capitalism for certain countries at least in the short term, they think, to allow kind of like almost like, they're not called this, but like digital nomad visas. So to allow people from one country, from the States, for instance, to enter into Portugal, for instance, and stay there for longer than their typical visa might allow, so that they bring in the income to that country. And so the countries are liking this, but then of course what's happening in very short order is, to go with the Portugal example, so like the average rent and housing cost in Lisbon is now through the roof. It's like 3 or 4 times what it was, even just some years ago. Don't quote me on exactly, the numbers there, but so it's pushing, the long-term residents out further and further from the city. These kinds of things are becoming a problem. But the digital nomad sort of lifestyle, right, is this freedom. It seems like a possibility of freedom. If you're lucky enough to have a job where you don't have to go into the office, which is more and more common post-COVID, although some companies are trying to bring that back, then why would you not, why wouldn't you want to see the world, be in this place and that place? You don't have to tie yourself to, living in a certain place. So there's sort of I think it depends in some ways, like with gender non-binary. I'd say what's kind of most important there is how an individual speaking being relates to that position, which is an identity position, but it is a liminal position. With something like the digital nomad, we could say on an individual level, the same is true. I'm thinking of, this is very different, but I'm thinking of like Frances McDormand in Nomadland.
Right.
For me, that film is her, a big part of it anyway, is her being stuck in the process of mourning. So she's doing this kind of circuit, but she's unable to move on in a different way with the loss of what she had with her husband. And it's beautiful film. But, so we can think of that on the individual level, but then it's so important to think about the effects at the cultural level too, and how, for instance, digital nomads, freedom, and, of course, it's not solving all the problems, I can be on vacation all the time, is also causing a lot of problems, especially for people who are already more stuck and more restricted by virtue of class in the first place. Okay, done talking for the moment.
Oh, that's great. There's a couple points I wish to sort of throw onto the table here. First off is this really, I think, dovetails nicely with a theory from Christian Salmon, the French cultural theorist, in his book called Bewitched on Storytelling, where he shows that, like in TED Talk culture and kind of elite neoliberalism, one of their mottos is that the self is a constantly constructed story. And so everything is about honing the art of telling your most authentic story. Right? And this is something we're all, I think, very encouraged in corporate culture as well, to perfect our story. And one of the things that he shows, right, is that behind the turn to storytelling of the self is a neoliberal labor discipline, whereby if you look at when storytelling became popular in the publishing industry, in the media, and in corporate America, it coincided with financial capitalism. And one of the things that financial capitalism requires, he says, is adaptation to permanent change. Because geographically, capital, and you probably know this here in Ireland, right? Capital only stays in one geographical location for an average of, I think, 7 months. Whereas in the industrial period of capitalism, it was more like, I think, something like 5 to 7 years. So the movement is now at kind of like an accelerated lightning speed. And I feel that perhaps from a materialist standpoint, that's one helpful way to understand how this is affecting our sense of subjectivity. I think in the Lacanian world, just as a sort of point of clarification, the subject is not the self. That's a whole thing we can discuss as well. But so that's liminality, and I want to encourage folks to pay attention to the ambivalence about the way that liminal subjectivity has a kind of ambivalent horizon of freedom. This is very difficult for the left, for left-wing politics, because what I think it means is that the dominant liberal culture that we live in has the trappings of something kind of like, on the one hand, very libertarian, but also seemingly liberatory for the self, right? And one of the things I feel that Lacan helps to clarify is the false basis of the presupposition of freedom in liberal. Like, Lacan is actually a great critic of liberal freedom, in my opinion. It's one of his great. Now, of course, I think, Deleuze and Guattari will exaggerate the extent to which that is authoritarian. I don't think that Lacan is reducible to some kind of authoritarian reactionary psychoanalyst and all of that. I think that's a very idiosyncratic 1960s appraisal of his work, which does not stand the test of time. It's something I've written about. But putting that to the side, I want to now go back and pivot back to the theory of the capitalist discourse, if we could. So a couple of things. You write in your article that the capitalist discourse presents the subject with an other that is not a site of authority, on the one hand. On the other hand, it presents the solution to our own discontent subjectively through a commodity. So the commodity functions as the sort of solution for relieving that discontent, for dealing with that discontent. And the effect of that being temporary, obviously, this is well known that the commodification can only go so far in terms of satiating our inner discontents and desires, leaves us wanting more. It leaves us with an excess. And this is what Lacan will call surplus. A surplus jouissance then becomes a problem. And talk about how that works. And also, the other thing to note here is that this is super important, and I think the site of a lot of confusion, frankly, is that the capitalist discourse does not resolve something which, in psychoanalytic terms, is necessary to resolve, which is this question of castration, right? Because people hear that and they think, wait a second, is the psychoanalytic view then that we must somehow bring back authority and castration? Because at first blush, that sounds a little anachronistic or old-fashioned. Of course, it's not really the case. So I want to invite you to say fill in a little bit more, if you would, about this problem of authority, the problem of castration, and the problem of this surplus of enjoyment that seems to fuck everything up in a certain way.
Yeah. So really good questions and big ones. So just to sort of speak to, and I think Lacan's mathemes are notorious for looking and being confusing. What the hell does this mean? And to me, anyway, the discourses are maybe some of the easiest to get into. You mentioned you're doing the graph of desire, and that's a really fun, interesting one. But that's probably the most notorious, perhaps, for being forget it. I'm gonna burn this book. But so the typical structure, I can't write it right now, of discourse, is and we've got, 4 positions. On the top left, we have the agent who addresses, there's an arrow, reaching over to the position of the other. Then there's a bar below the other. And then the next step is the product, whatever's produced by the interaction of, the agent and the other turning to the other. And then there's no relationship then to what's in the position of the truth, which is on the bottom of under the bar, underneath the position of the agent on the left side. And so that's basically like what's repressed in the discourse. I'll just give an example with the discourse of the master to then shift to the discourse of the capitalist. Oh, very good. Okay, beautiful.
There we go.
So I don't have to do weird hand gestures.
Pardon the little notations. I always use this slide for my seminars and study groups, but this is a visual of the 4 discourses and then the 5th evil one below.
Yes. Kind of did an evil laugh there too. Yeah. Okay. So there's no relationship between the object A, the product, in the position of the product in the discourse of the master, and the split subject. So what's repressed in the discourse of the master is that, the master too is castrated, is lacking, has an unconscious, doesn't really, when you say, I think the best thing to do is this, or I am a Pisces, there's part of you that doesn't really know what you're talking about, or, that doesn't completely state it, or doesn't state it well enough, et cetera, et cetera. So that's what's repressed there. Lacan calls the capitalist discourse a kind of contemporary subversion of, or perversion of, if you will, the master's discourse, one that was becoming more and more common in his time, as he noted. And so what's immediately apparent here is that in the top left hand corner, so the agent that mobilizes the discourse is the split subject in the capitalist discourse, just like in the discourse of the hysteric. And in the discourse of the hysteric, that basically means you're a speaking being who's saying, I've got some kind of complaint, I'm suffering somehow, and I'm addressing that suffering or complaint to another. And another who, moreover, is given some kind of power or authority to understand something about it or do something about it, who then is kind of put to work. It could be, I lost my glasses, where are my glasses? It could be like, these are really just sort of simple, like everyday. It doesn't have to be someone who's structurally hysteric, saying this. It's just to say you have certain kind of suffering, and you're addressing that to another. Well, in the capitalist discourse, yeah, you're a suffering subject, but I suppose one common difference is we tend to think about the discourse of the hysteric insofar as the hysteric is aware at some level that there's not going to be that the reason why he or she is suffering is something that they don't understand. So, more typically, it's not like, where are my glasses? More typically, we think about this, especially within the context of the analytic situation, where it's like I'm suffering and I don't kind of know something about it, but not really, like help. So that would be the optimal position, Lacan says, for a starting position for the analysand, to be like, hey, analyst, I view you as some kind of authority, the subject that I suppose to know something about my unconscious, something about stuff that I don't know about that is contributing to my suffering. But in the capitalist discourse, it's more that the speaking being is like, I'm suffering because I don't have enough jouissance. That in this kind of age of commanded enjoyment, commanded jouissance, and with the fable, I suppose, story being told that that it's possible to feel whole and complete. So this is more of a fetishistic way of relating to lack. So this is a subject who assigns some kind of concrete cause to their suffering, for which the other at large maybe has an answer, and that answer is the S1. So the authority down here, on the bottom left-hand side, in the position of the truth, becomes more like a product or an experience. So it's
Right.
it's not another person.
Right.
But what happens is you see the arrow is flipped here in the capitalist discourse.
The arrow down here does not, as in the other four, go from a subject to another person. In the capitalist discourse, it's subject and an S1, product or commodity.
Exactly.
Which is really important about liminality, because it means that liminality is like kind of the way of having a non-relation. There is no other required in a certain way for discourse to happen. So,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
which also what you mean by authority too. Like, it's not so much like capitalism is bad because we don't have a traditional father. No, it's that there's a structural absence of a relation to a field of otherness that would be necessary for the discourse to function or to work or to be efficacious.
Right. Yeah. So there's no, he says this discourse runs on casters, basically. It's this circuit, because there's no anchoring points.
Right. He calls it a roulette, like like it just goes around and around and around.
Yeah. So
and it looks at first blush a lot like the hysterics discourse, because a lot of commentators have shown that hysteria and perversion are like inescapable in here. And I do want to talk about how perversion emerges here, because it's such a huge part of your essay as well. But I'll let you introduce that as you will.
Sure. Yeah. So, as you said, such a big difference here is that instead of the speaking being who's suffering addressing another with their complaints, they're like, well, let's just go straight for the product or experience that can fill my lack, whatever that might be. And that can be things that, in their, I don't know, things like the practice of yoga, which is part of a larger, set of Eastern philosophies. We can relate to just about anything in a fetishistic way, even if it's not, the original thing is not intended as such. So I'm not saying like all people who do yoga are doing this.
It's even pronounced in this whole notion of the possibility of AI becoming a source of friendship, as a stand-in for friendship, or even this tendency, which I think has proliferated post-pandemic, of a kind of antisocial tendency in our culture of ghosting, of this like right, of ghosting as so there's like a whole question about responsibility is like not necessary, right? This kind of there's like an ethical thing. So it's good. Like, I know that these may frustrate people, and I'll take them off the screen in a moment because I think they are frustrating, you know, for some, but I just also want, they are also frankly an invitation. These diagrams are an invitation to immerse yourself into the Lacanian framework. And I would just say that they have some payoff if you spend some time with them. Would you agree with that, by the way? I'm sorry to interrupt, but you can go back to your train of thought, but
Yeah.
Because I know inevitably some people will be like, what are these two people doing talking about these math themes and these crazy things? But actually, I think my contention, and perhaps you agree, is that these are actually like very instructive little devices here.
I think so too. Yeah, that's what I was starting to say, is they, sort of have a bad reputation, but one of the things that I think can take us so many places with Lacan, as opposed to other forms of analytic thinking, is thinking in terms of structure. The details and the content of particular people in their lives or particular societies are absolutely necessary to bring into the conversation, but we can get lost in the weeds if we don't look at the way in which discourse operates as a structure, so that there's the agent, the other, the product, the position of truth, and then what happens when you kind of switch these around, that's Lacan goes on about the ills of practicing analysis within the discourse of the master for his whole career instead of the discourse of the analyst. That it's all about the position with which you relate to your own lack and relate to the other, that have just profoundly different effects. But so here with the capitalist discourse, so in a way, all the discourses except for the discourse of the analyst create more suffering. They're a way to sort of maybe nominate it, to tame it, with a certain discourse, but at the same time, the position of the product in the bottom right-hand corner is what Lacan, as you have here on the right-hand side, in his post-seminar 17, discussed as the position of surplus jouissance, to get to your surplus enjoyment. So there's some sort of like disappointment, like I've given it a good go here to address my suffering, and what has it gotten me here? And in the capitalist discourse, it's not just any figure that we see in the position of surplus jouissance, it's the object A itself, which is the which means surplus jouissance, basically the object cause of jouissance and one of its faces, and the object cause of desire. So it's what happens when you go directly, you try to aim directly at becoming the best, bringing out your inner leader. I don't know. It creates more disappointment. Okay, what you expected, the anticipated jouissance is not, the expected jouissance is not what you get. But within this discourse, if you're stuck in it, you just keep circling around. Okay, well, maybe this other book will help, or maybe taking a vacation will help, or something. You just circle around saying, maybe this next thing will be the S1 that really does fill my lack. And we can say that there's so surplus enjoyment. It can be experienced as excessive, as sort of like boundary breaking. But what at its roots it is lack. It is the negative. It is hitting up against the stuff of our lack, of the being disturbed and unsettled by the drives, by the core of the real, at the heart of the speaking being, if there is a heart. Just to say that we enjoy the anticipation that, this product, this is going to be the thing. I can't wait. In some ways, a lot more than the now, being present in the now, etc. The temporality of it is, in some ways, directly opposed to what happens or what should happen in the discourse of the analyst when you're practicing analysis. And it's the looking for more enjoyment in the future that never arrives. But I would say it's also enjoyed this loss. You know very well that buying the new car or whatever isn't gonna it's not gonna be the last thing that you want in your whole life. We're talking about the level of demand here. What's cut out in the discourse of the capitalist, which makes it a perverse discourse, is the level of desire. That there's always something else that the product can't hit upon, that the semblance of the object A can't arrive at. So there is a way in which we absolutely enjoy complaining, about the shortcomings of the capitalist discourse. And that's certainly symptomatic to the discourse. The thing to do isn't to keep complaining about it and then enjoying the anticipation of the thing that we know is going to fall short. The thing to do is to have a different definition of our lack in the first place. One that can't be filled, and two, of something about which we don't know, and that the other, turning relationally to another can, perhaps help do something about, but we don't know.
Brilliant. That's extremely elucidating, and I've put the diagrams down, so we're done torturing the viewers, but maybe people listening on audio will not be so tortured, or maybe you enjoy that torture.
Exactly.
And as we do. Now, one of the things you say is that the pervert maintains a tenuous belief, and that they derive a certain satisfaction out of humiliating the other and eliciting anxiety in the other as a victim.
Mm-hmm.
And in the act of doing this, they bring the voice into operation, and there's also a logic of a substitute. And so when I was reading about this operation of perversion, I was just thinking of how this stuff plays out in online culture, in call out culture, cancel culture. There's now, according to many educators, I think for younger generations, a kind of paralysis about even attempting to construct a kind of project. So there's a public project in some ways, precisely because people fear this perverse situation? What if this happens to me? There's the flip side of that, which is people that are more established can kind of survive being whatever canceled in these different ways. For example, I've noticed that various musicians that were like canceled 3 years ago now we're back on tour, and I'm like, wait a second, I suppose your crimes were not great enough. I don't want to talk about cancel culture per se. I want to keep it at this question of your article, because what I think you're trying to bring out is that there is a structural sort of, we can sort of derive a structural account regarding the frequency and the intensity of cruelty. So I want to invite you now, I think, with our remaining time, to maybe introduce what really is sort of the heart of your wider piece, as I see it, and or at least to me, like what's most interesting, because part of what you're saying is that while Lacan doesn't necessarily theorize this, one of the things that we live with is this structural cruelty of the system. And I think that we struggle to understand, like, why the hell are people treating each other this way? Often, right, for what seems to be kind of pathetic reasons or sort of like questionable causes or grounds, which even the fact that that's the case, right, even further shows how the system generates it. Why is that going on? And why is cruelty and perversion so central to it all?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm gonna dive in and then maybe ask you to help me out and say more what you where you were going with that. I'm struggling a little bit, but just to start by saying that in one way in which we can think of the capitalist discourse as being perverse is that it's backed and reinforced by a commandment to enjoy more and more and more. And that, Lacan comments something like the pervert is, the subject who pursues jouissance as far as it's possible to do so. And what we've got here is maybe one way to say it might be to allude to Lacan, the capitalist discourse is like the neurotic's dream of being a pervert, at least on the surface. That, oh, it'd be so great if I were just uninhibited and I could do this and that. That's not actually, I mean, I do analytic work with individuals who are perversely structured, and there's quite a bit of suffering associated with it. That in part has to do with the reduction of everything to like a concrete object to be had or an experience to be had. Reduction of the other's desire to the structure of demand. And so, personally, I would say that I do feel that perversely structured subjects have repression at some level, that there's primal repression that's been undergone, and therefore they're subjects. So it's not like they can't access the structure of desire, but their go-to is to position themselves as the instrument of the other's jouissance, the big other's jouissance, or the object cause of the other's jouissance. And whenever we're talking about jouissance, we're talking about something that's it's not just pleasure principle sailing along, cool breeze, whipping through your hair. It's excessive, and it's disruptive, and it's painful. It's exciting. It could be depression, though. Like if you're flooded with, in certain forms of depression, you're flooded with jouissance, basically a kind of painful, like despair. So just to say that there's a kind of cruelty in this path of commanded jouissance that we can easily link to Lacan's comments about the superego's cruelty. And the superego, he says, like sort of fundamentally, structurally, what the superego says or does is to command enjoyment. You say enjoy, exclamation mark. There's the Coca-Cola branding, and it might seem, what? What do you mean? The superego is that aspect of ourselves. It's always saying you're falling short and you suck, or etc. But it's specifically in relation to your lack, and it's a this excessive sort of painful way of sticking to the path of jouissance versus the path of desire, of subjective desire, which in fact has more freedom. So as you were saying, there's the allure in the capitalist discourse of freedom and possibility and choice. The possibilities of liminal positions in society, but in fact, insofar as it's on the register of the drives of jouissance, of the reduction, of flattening of desire and the unconscious basically into demand, it's actually quite restrictive and quite cruel, and we're suffering on account of that. So let me pause and see if maybe you can come in with what you were saying about cancel culture, or I wasn't quite getting
I
that.
suppose that's one of the things that initially comes to my mind, in part for political reasons. It's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, there is a kind of public tribunal that is beyond just this kind of depersonalized logic of a superego, of some kind of like interiorized voice of the censor, which all subjects alike kind of share in common, and we sort of internalize it. On the flip side, there's also an intensification of the public tribunal making errors and reversing plans of a seemingly socially just or righteous form of call-out culture, cancel culture, which ends up actually undermining the principles upon which it's based. So, for example, like Norman Finkelstein has written a very interesting book about cancel culture. Of course, I've written a review of it, and I don't agree with all of his contentions, but he and others have shown that unfortunately, cancel culture has actually been a way of a class top down, not bottom up, which was never its intention. It was never its design, right? So there's a certain way in which when I think of cruelty, I think close to home about the way of building a left counterpublic that can create ways to not participate in this kind of commanded cruelty, or even, for example, to me, there's nothing worse than those fleeting moments where I too see myself gaining enjoyment from something like a pile-on, or harming somebody without evidence, or following, this kind of thing. So that's one manifestation. Of course, there's many. I mean, Trump, we could spend multiple episodes just talking about the structure of cruelty within the discourse of Trump and Trumpism. So there's a lot of nodes. There's a lot of sites, right, where cruelty has this structural expression. In your piece, I have the feeling that one of the sites where it expresses itself, and this is often individually interiorized, is the feeling that one is letting down the commandment for constant becoming, for this liminal becoming, that one is not good enough, that they have failed in that. But that then is ambiguous because it's like, well, the site of who I've let down is actually unclear. It's
Right.
acephalic. It's not like a, it's not like a boss per se. It's not that I've let my boss down. It's that I've let my own internal absorption of this ideal down.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where I'm coming from with this. I was just using
Yeah.
that as sort of as a site of an example. I know it's like a thorny example, right? Because many times cancel culture, I mean, if we're talking about like the far right, like, I have no
Mm-hmm.
problem, canceling like Nazis and stuff like this is no question. Where I see ambiguity is the fact that this tendency also has the capacity to be deleterious to egalitarian left-wing movements. Just seen in my firsthand experience.
Yeah.
That's where
I
I'm
think
coming from on that.
those are really important points that I think you made well yourself. I just add that, so one of my arguments is about, there's an endless source of guilt that, as you put it, is sort of acephalous, to not being true to yourself. But it's like, well, what is the self? What does that mean, especially if you're supposed to be constantly reinventing yourself? That fits perfectly with the neoliberal ideology, which is to blame the speaking being and, ignore the problems with the system at large. And so, the aggression in that instance, of course, gets turned inward. The sadism of the system gets internalized, as far as that goes, and just fuels the fire for trying again and again to, make it in this neoliberal capitalist way. Go ahead.
Well, I was wondering, like, speaking now more clinically, I was wondering if you might say something about how you help, if that's the right word, relieve that pressure. Or I don't even know if that's the role of an analyst per se to help. Pardon the poor framing of that, but you see the point, which would be one of the things my own analyst always tries to mention or reinforce is this importance of actually lessening one's ideal, because the pressure of the ideal can foment a kind of internal aggressivity, right? And I was just curious to me, because if you make this distinction between desire, that the voice of that commanded surplus enjoyment that elicits guilt, you kind of suggested, well, actually, this is drive, and this is a kind of demand that also can be rejected, right? The subject actually can find its site of becoming elsewhere, right? Now, I mean, maybe you would just say, yeah, well, everyone should just do analysis. That problem is solved, yeah.
If only, yeah, right.
But perhaps there's another way to think about that. About, does that, because, Bernard Stiegler, one of my favorite, he recently passed away, unfortunately, French philosophers, he has this kind of nice formula, which is capitalism kills desire. And I think actually it's kind of accurate in a certain way. And then, of course, then the question is, all right, well, and this also introduces the problem of castration, which you haven't mentioned yet. I do want you to say something about that. If for no other reason than the fact that it's one of those words that gets Lacanians into trouble, because it's like, well, why do you people keep insisting upon this? So yeah, maybe, yeah, I guess that's my question, is like, how do you bring the pressure down on all of that, right?
Good question. If only we had the power to make mass systemic changes at any one time, that would be nice. In my fantasy anyway. But so beyond what happens within the discourse of the analyst, which is, it's a privileged space for all those who can engage in it, and, would say it's not only for the rich, of course. There's absolutely ways to engage in it at lower, more affordable fees.
Yep.
But
Sliding
that,
scales, things like that.
yeah, and the U.S., by the way, is really bad at that, though, compared to, like, I'm in Ireland now.
A lot of
and
really accomplished Lacanian psychoanalysts also do Zoom, and so they insist on it. I know there's probably limitations with Zoom, but it does help, I think, with payment.
Makes it more accessible. Yeah, absolutely. But just, I know we only have a few minutes, so I just want to kind of sort of address your question, which is to say that desire in Lacanian theory is more complicated than just, like, wanting a sandwich. And we don't have time to get into that, but it goes, it sort of has a reciprocal relationship to your lack and the other's lack. And to question what it is that you think you know, to question what it is that you think that you want, and why can correspond to, like you mentioned, the ideals, of the other, and can help take the edge off. Just this practice of questioning, why do I think that's a good, thing? And, that's sort of like narrative therapy, postmodern 101, but it's something, and it's something we all can engage in, of kind of poking a hole in the assumption that there's a kind of unquestioned truth status in any one ideal, and why, specifically, like, why are we attracted to this ideal? Why have we slaved away for it? What do we get out of it? Sort of these questions of jouissance can help us start to disentangle and, find some different ways to relate.
Yeah, it's powerful, because Lacan's point is no one ideal is not barred. It's always a site of a certain inconsistency, and I think that we worry that knowledge, right, that our ideals are lacking, or that they won't offer a sense of completion or wholeness. We worry that will disturb our desire itself, and so we want to cling to them even more. And to a certain extent, that's true. I mean, people in fidelity to an ideal can be extremely productive. They can also be extremely internally fractured and ill at ease, and so on, right? So anyways, in our remaining time, Stephanie, I just wanted to say how much I really appreciated your article here. And did we sort of say enough about the structure, I think, of perversion? Because I feel like you've written this book on perversion, and you really know it really, really well. In a sense, I wonder, right, like, to what extent, not perversion as a clinical structure, but like the idea that this discourse of, or the age of the capitalist discourse somehow forces all of us into a perverse relationality. What does that mean? Because Lacan also has some ideas about perverts that also, like, they are subjects of belief. Like, remember Pascal in Seminar 16 is like a perverse subject, but also, like, he's like the faithful subject. Is there anything emancipatory about perversion? I'm just curious. Or how do you deal with this fact? So I'm just wanted to say a few final things about that, if you don't mind.
Oh man, we don't have enough time. We really don't, to talk about those important questions. So, uh, you know, we're sort of all pushed into this position that is akin to the position of the pervert, insofar as we have the proliferation of fetishistic ways of relating. Um, that without realizing it, it's so easy to do that, and to engage in, disavowal through, if only I do this, sort of in the back of your mind, then I'll be whole, and the other will be whole, and everything will be, great. But also, as you say, disavowal on the side of belief, that there's just something that's fractured and obviously weak about, just authority in our time, and that it takes a lot of kind of mental acrobatics to see any one other as having an authority, and that is sort of akin to what the pervert does. And I'll just, got to end there, but yeah,
Brilliantly said. Stephanie, I want to thank you so much for writing this essay, for your work more generally. And I'd love to invite you back onto Emancipations at a later date to talk about your new work on empathy, to, maybe even offer some kind of course, perhaps, if you would be so inclined. We can approach that in the future. But thank you so much. I think this was extremely illuminating as a kind of introduction to some of these concepts. Hopefully get people thinking a little bit more. I'll provide links to Stephanie's work in the show notes. And thank you so much again.
Thanks so much for having me, Daniel. It's my pleasure.
All right, until next time, guys. All the best.